So I think we are ready to go. We've got Sarah and Glen here. So Sarah, welcome, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. And it's a huge pleasure to be back here tonight with an Australian producer of mine and a particular favourite. I was very lucky when I was buying the Australian portfolio for the Wine Society to visit Kooyong on 3 different occasions. And I have to say that one of my most memorable tastings was, in fact, with Glen, as we were in his barrel hall, sort of tasting around different wines and really getting under the skin of the different ways in which he was treating different plots and different vineyards. And I think that that's something that Kooyong have always really clearly defined within their range, the kind of looking at precisely where the grapes are from and what they're growing on, and then their impact throughout the process and treating them differently or treating them in a very particular way so that they enhance the various flavors. I also have to say, I know that it's a shame that Freddie couldn't be here with you tonight, but gosh, I miss having Australian Chardonnay more frequently now that I buy a lot more Italian wine. And you seem to get buyer's palate. You always drink what you're working with. So I am delighted to be here tonight with a glass of Fault Line 2018. I have already seen in the chat that a number of you have some great wines open, lots from Australia, some Kooyong, but I'm hoping that this evening you'll discover why it is that I'm really excited about these wines, why Glen is just a wonderful winemaker, and hopefully you'll all go and buy some of the small amounts of stock we've got left on our website, because these wines are rare. They're only made in small quantities and we love having them, but they do sell out. So don't spend too long thinking about it. Glen, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's very early in Australia. We may be celebrating Australia Day in style with a glass of Aussie Chardonnay, but I imagine you've got a good flat white going. How are
Long black
you?
actually today, yeah, black coffee. That's the winemaker's wine drink of choice first thing in the morning.
I
So
was going to
yeah,
say, I thought that was beer.
that's during harvest only during
Okay,
harvest. So
okay.
yeah, we're not quite there yet, almost,
We'll let you
but
off.
yeah, not yet. So
Brilliant.
all right, so we get stuck into it. I think
That'd be wonderful. I think we have a
yeah,
presentation.
we do. We might have some
Here we
pictures.
go.
Okay. Oh, that's easy. Okay, well we'll start here because I think having so many people and different levels of knowledge with regards to Mornington, I think this map's a really nice place to start. So if you look up on the top left there, you'll see there's a map of Australia, actually, just a small little map and a little black dot all the way down the bottom. So that just sort of indicates exactly where we are. If you then look at the little map under that, if you've ever been to Australia, Melbourne is on a big bay, and as you go down the coast, or well, it's not really a coast, but the edge of the bay, that is what becomes the Mornington Peninsula, which is what you see on the much larger scale. So I think geographically, in terms of Australia, it's interesting to note again, like it's a very small black dot, but you can see how far south we are is probably number one, quite important, but also seeing on the second map that we are surrounded by water everywhere, and that is also quite unique for not just Australia, but in the world to have this much water around a growing area. So traditionally, I think when people think Australia, they think Shiraz, maybe some Cabernet, warmer climate, bigger, jammy, some very ripe, warm styles of wine, which Australia does very well, and they come out of more northern and more western regions from where we are. But down in our part of Australia, we grow Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and a little bit of Pinot Gris as well. Somewhat decided by the weather. Obviously, being south is quite important, but as I mentioned, the water influence on the peninsula is quite important. So looking at the bigger picture on that map, you can see there's little arrows beautifully indicating the way that the wind comes off the water. But that little red square in the middle is our vineyard. And oh, there we go, perfect. And at any one point, it's about, we've got 2 bays on either side and then the ocean on the south. We're about 8 kilometers from the water on both sides. So for us, it's an important part of our climatic makeup is that water. So as you can imagine, in Australia, a lot of hot air comes from the north across the desert. A huge part of Australia is desert. So during right now in the summer, we can get some very, very hot winds coming from the north. At night though, particularly, we can get a lot of cooling air coming off the ocean and off the water, which really helps maintain our temperature. So if you compared us to some more inland regions, they get warmer days and cooler nights. So for us, we don't get as warm and we don't get as cold. So we sort of hover in between. And so that's, as it turns out, pretty good for Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. It means we do struggle to grow other varieties for that reason. We can't really grow late season varieties such as Cabernet Sauvignon or something like Grenache, for instance, that need a much longer growing season because of the way we just don't get the highs and lows that pull that season out. In early April, we can get a big change in weather and it turns wet, cold, damp, windy, very windy. It's always windy, but very, very windy. And it's just, the season stops quite quickly. So yeah, geographically, that's what makes us unique in Australia. So around Melbourne, there are another 3 or 4 regions known for growing Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And then obviously to the south, there's Tasmania. So in terms of Tasmania, obviously it's a lot cooler down there. It's very far south. It's the influence from the ocean is quite strong. But then compared to the other regions, we've got the Yarra Valley on one side of us. We've got Macedon. They're more higher altitude, but not as cold. Cooler nights, warmer days, and they don't get that sort of ocean influence. So they're more inland regions. So yeah, from that perspective.
I remember sitting out one evening in Mornington, and the evenings are incredibly pleasant. That sort of breeze, but not too cold. Yeah, it is a lovely climate.
The good days are really good, and then you can get the wind, and when the wind picks up, it can be quite strong. And we'll talk about that after when the individual sites. But exposure to the wind is a big influence in some of our vineyards, the ones that look at the ocean or are a bit closer towards the ocean or on an exposed hill. Yeah, there's good days and bad days in Mornington. If you've got a good day, you can consider yourself lucky, I think.
I did. I had a great day. On a different note, Glenn, we've had a couple of comments that you might be a little bit quiet for some of our members. If you're close enough to your microphone, perhaps, but
sure, I can.
We always like seeing a good solid head in these frames.
I can, or let me just.
Always better address these things early on.
Yeah, is that different or better?
Okay. That is different. We're getting some loud enough comments coming through, so hopefully that will work.
I just changed that setting. If that's better, does it sound better?
Yeah, I think I was hearing you before, but I thought it was definitely worth.
Saying it's
oh no.
Oh, quieter now.
Back to before. That works. Ooh. That's working for me.
Okay. Let's stick with that then. That's I'll talk louder if that's better.
Great.
All good. That's better. Okay, good.
Good.
Sorry, where are we? Yes.
Apologies.
So, yeah. No, it's good to better be here to be heard. So yes, I think generally speaking, in terms of style, even though we are a cooler climate, we do get sort of roundness and ripeness in the wines. We don't lack ripeness. So we have a very interesting sort of to and fro between that sort of cooling ocean influence, but also that sunnier Australian style that we are still in Australia. We still do get sunshine. We can still get quite warm during summer. So for instance, today is actually quite cool. It's about 22, but yes, 2 days ago it was 35. So, you know, we've always got this kind of pushback coming from the north. And so because of that, we get acidity and freshness in the wine, but we can also get some ripeness, and we don't get acidity as opposed to, we're not sitting on either end of the scale. Sometimes to fight for acidity in Australia, you have to pick quite early and you might not get sort of the full ripeness that you're looking for. Whereas, being in Mornington, we get a nice balance of ripeness and acidity, which I think really lends itself to a sort of appeal in the wines, if you will. That gives you a nice moorishness and a drinkability, but also that acidity to really drive the wine and make the wine complete. So Mornington as a whole, just generally speaking, it's a very small region for Australia. We don't make a lot of wine. I don't remember the actual number, but it's something like we make 0.5% of Australians, like half of 1% of Australia's output comes out of Mornington. So as you can imagine, that's very small. Late 70s, early 80s is when the industry really started to get going. Mornington forever has been considered sort of the playground of Melbourne's elite, or just rich, wealthy, I guess. All that coastline on the inner bay is just covered in homes and houses, summer homes, beaches, things of that nature. And what was once agricultural land is now very much being taken over by real estate. So in terms of growth, we don't have a huge amount of area to grow into because it is surrounded by a lot of homes and people, and it's only getting smaller. So for us, Kooyong was established in the mid-1990s, which there's a bit of a boom, not just in Mornington, but in Australia in the 90s. And a nice big piece of land that used to be, would have once had forest on it that was deforested. A lot of that area was just trees pulled out, sent to Melbourne, and then turned into pasture land. I think, that was very typical of the area. And then orchards and vineyards started moving in. So our property is 100 acres of vineyard, or 40 hectares. Of that, it's about 2/3 Pinot Noir. And then the majority of the rest is Chardonnay with a little bit of Pinot Gris. Perfect. So that map, actually, if you can go back, sorry, just to the overall map, if that's possible. So we have 2 dots there. I should mention the other vineyard. So the biggest section is the Kooyong Vineyard, which is our home vineyard. It's where the Kooyong wines come from. In the 90s, this other vineyard in Balnarring was established, and we purchased it about 11 years ago, and for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and we used that to help supplement some of the wines, the Marsal and the Clenal wines. So geographically, it's very similar in Mornington. Mornington has 2 distinct regions, the northern part and the southern part. So we're in the northern part, which is on the sandier, it's not flat, but it's a very gentle, long slopes that we get, about 100 meters above sea level. And then, as you can see, the darker area on the map, that's the higher altitude areas, which there's plenty of vineyards up there. And so for them, we consider that's a bit cooler, higher altitude, a bit finer. Where we are down in the north, we get a little bit more ripeness, a little bit more warmth in the wines that comes from there. So then, yeah, okay, you can jump back to the other one. Perfect. So yes, you can see the color coding makes it very, very easy to tell what's going on. We do have different shades of Pinot Noir, and that's to reflect the different clones and rootstocks that we have on the property. So Sarah mentioned it earlier. So when this property was planted or established, a lot of thought and effort went into deciding where all these blocks would go and what would go on which area. A lot of soil surveys were taken, a lot of deliberation over areas and sizes and swapping of clones. So what you can see, it's hard to tell a little bit from the map, but you can see some gaps between some of the vineyards, and you can see some blocks that are a little smaller and some are bigger. So that was trying to find where samples had been taken, and it indicated that something was changing. So the soil was changing, a little bit of an aspect was changing, just something different was happening. And because of that, the decision was made to split blocks, put in different clones, and see what comes of it. So, for instance, the lighter colours in the mirrors, for instance, that indicates there's a couple of clones in there that we actually coded the colours of the clones according to what the sort of weight of the wine, if you will. So the darker the Pinot, the darker the colour. So
of course you did.
Of course,
this is wonderful. Of course you did.
We had to think hard about it. We couldn't just put colours, and it looked really drab when it was just one colour for Pinot Noir. So we had to change it. So that's a little bit. It's a little bit of a cheat because different clones do different things in different areas. But I think it's important that you can visually see that we have about 11 different Pinot clones and 8 Chardonnay clones, which is a lot, and some are small. Some only make up one little section, but there's a couple of others that are more the workhorse, or not workhorse as such, but just we have more volume coming from those specific clones. So yeah, a lot of foresight and a lot of effort went into planting that vineyard, and today we reap the benefits of that. And in particular, we make what we call single block or single vineyard wines, which if you, I'm not reading the chat, but if people are drinking any of them, so Sarah's got the fault line bottle, that's it, and I do. Sorry, hold on. And there's also a bottle of years as well. Sorry, I can't see. There we go. Make sure I'm on. There's years. So these two wines are part of 5, and the 5 are the 5 blocks that you can see on the screen there. So the 2 Chardonnay single vineyards, which are the Fault Line and the Farrago, and then the 3 Pinots, the Mears, the Ferris, and the Haven. We have a 6th block right at the top of the page there, which we've lovingly called New Pinot. One day we hope that will become the 4th single block wine off the property. It's a newer planting, so we've done some different things in there, some different density and some new clones that weren't available when we were planting the other part of the property. But we want to wait until we think the quality is there before we ever decide to release that wine. So probably maybe a few years still, but that's hopefully in the future.
That's very exciting. At the moment, we have 4 of the single vineyards available, so all but Ferris.
All but Ferris, yes, and as you mentioned, those are the very slim volumes as well.
Yes.
So take for instance Mears, which I just showed the bottle. You can see in that block. So the big Pinot section there, and then there's a little bit of Pinot Gris on the side, which goes into our Pinot Gris, obviously. But you can see there's one slither in the middle that's thinner than the others. All that is what makes up the Mears. It just comes out of that section. So you can tell just by a quick visual, that's probably 10% or something. The rest of those grapes go into our other labels, which is the Marsal, and we have a Kooyong Estate wine as well, which sits in between. So, we're talking very slim, very micro section of the vineyard that we have chosen as our, it's our favorite, but it's also what we think speaks most clearly of that block in particular. So we see different flavors in the blocks, different structure, different levels of intensity, different characteristics, and we want to find the part that really stands out and stands differently to its friends. And for us, it's just that little slither of Mears is what gets bottled as that wine. So yeah, very small production in comparison to the Marsal, which comes off a lot more of the parcels. So yeah, I think as an overview, that's pretty straightforward. When you're tasting the Fault Line, for instance, you can sort of see the continuation. If you've got the Clenal, so the Clenal Chardonnay comes off about 5 of those little sections on that map, but it also comes from our other vineyard in Balnarring. and that makes up that wine. So with the Clonal, you know, it can be brighter, fruitier, a bit juicier, but also looking very similar in style. But then when you move to the fault line, you know, we do use a little bit more oak, a little bit more time in oak. We're looking for more intensity, more seriousness, more power, more complexity in the wine. So it is a, you know, the sort of reserve, quote unquote. It's I don't like using that term, but that's kind of the direction it goes. But it is also unique in the fact that it is coming off a very, very individual part of land. So very much in the Burgundian model is where it was originated, and that's where the ideas came from. That, you know, that's how they've set up their vineyards. And Chardonnay, definitely, but Pinot Noir to the extreme loves to show influence of where it's grown, not just in the region, but then sub-regionally, and then also in a micro sense in the vineyard. We see big differences between blocks that are right next to each other. And it's really interesting if you ever get the chance to taste the three together. I love showing the map to people because it's just a reminder of how close these three vineyards actually are. These aren't, you know, 15 kilometers down the road or something. This is 200 meters to the left is where one finishes and one starts.
Yeah.
And we can end up with two, you know, they've always got a similarity. You know, they share a lot of similarities from the, you know, the soil is different, but it's not an extreme difference between the blocks, but there are subtle differences. So they always have something in common, but then they have quite a bit of difference as well that kind of separates them and gives them their individual character as well.
Yeah.
All right. So the wines, we've also got the Marsala, which is quite popular. Oh, you've got it. Perfect. So
I do. I
put mine just here so you can see that.
No, I have a second glass ready.
Oh, perfect. So this is probably the wine we're most known for, just because of volume. As you can see from that map, we do grow, as I said, we grow more Pinot Noir than we do Chardonnay. So because of that, we do more volume. Very typical. So 2019 was a very intense season. It was a very good season, but it was very compressed. So we had some warmth at harvest, and when you're dealing with early ripening varieties that are very fickle, pretty much everything was ready at the one time. So we had to do about 3 weeks worth of work in about 7 days. I think it was. I don't remember. It was just a blur.
Long days.
We just didn't stop. We picked and just got everything in. And so in the season, I think 19, you see, I think the Marsala is a very typical Kooyong Pinot Noir in that it's got lots of like black cherry and red cherry flavors. You know, it's got a suppleness and a softness to the mid palate, but also, you know, a little bit of structure, a little bit of tannin. We can get some very strong tannin from our vineyards.
It's got wonderful precision. So yes. there's enough structure to sort of hold the weight of fruit, because although the color is quite light, in this light it's not very easy to see. I have a light shining at my face, but it's quite light in color, and actually it has a lot of fruit on the nose. You were saying cherry and sort of red currant, but on the palate it's quite tight, and it's got real precision and length. It's sort of a linear nature, and it's shining. I haven't tried the 19 before. I think I last tried the 18 vintage of yours, so I'm delighted to see it. It's also good. Very well balanced. If you say it was a slightly riper vintage at 13.5, that's nicely balanced.
That was the challenge, and that was the heat of 19. Probably having heat at vintage it just pushes the sugars along a little bit, but the flavors were still in a happy position. So for us, we don't ever want to go above 13.5, but we do constantly sort of push towards that number in those warmer seasons. And when it's made up of, effectively, there's 20 different parcels of fruit make its way into the Marsala. We get everything from 13.5 down to 12.5, and we blend them all together, and we end up with wherever we end up. So it is very much a blend of the vineyard and the blend of the season, or the taste of the season. So yeah, for me, I think fruit is always a like a key feature in Mornington Pinot Noirs, and it might sound like a weird statement, but you know, red cherry, black cherry in the warm seasons, raspberry, currants, cranberry, flavors like that. That's kind of where we sit. And some blocks, once we get into the single vineyard wines, you can start to see more floral characters like rose petal or violets and things like that. Not so much in the Marsal, but in the higher end wines. And I think that's always that extra nice little bit that you get with the others. And then underneath all that, a lot of savory notes that are from the vineyard, but also I think from the winemaking or the winery as well. You know, the influence of the oak, but a little bit more of that sort of undergrowthy, savory edge that I like to see on the palate of all our wines of all levels. Like you said, precision, and you know, that's a word we use a lot in the winery. We talk about focus when we talk about the wine quite a bit.
Oh. Back to vineyard shots and netted.
Netted, wow, that's very topical. So we've been putting nets on this week. So this year, 2021, we're about 4 weeks from harvest, you know, maybe, 4 weeks. And the colours are starting to, or the grapes are starting to change colour ever so slightly from red grapes are green. They look like green frozen peas for you know, a couple of months, and then they start to soften and start to get a shade of red before they go fully red. And the birds are a huge problem for us. They would devastate the entire crop. As you can tell, you can see in the back of that picture, there's quite a bit of native bushland. It surrounds our property. We have a big bushland area on the property. The birds live in there and they love to come out and they get out. So those photos, you can see obviously the nets are up. That's because when we're harvesting, we lift them up and then we work under the nets to pick. And then that way we can drive the tractor in and out. So that looks like a very cool start to a morning in harvest time. So that's a very
beautiful shot.
Yeah, that's lovely. That would be.
How high are the vines trained to be able to work underneath them? I guess that's one of the big differences between Burgundy vine heights and Australia.
Yeah, so in Burgundy, what we call the fruiting zone. So when you train it outwards, it's quite low. It's probably like shin high to knee high. Whereas in Australia, we're more. Oh yeah, it's awful. And in Australia, we're more around your sort of waist to chest height. So you know, the vines. I'm a bit shorter than 2 meters, but the vines are a little bit over my head. So we work at a slightly higher level in Australia. OH&S is much better. So there are people trialing some more Burgundian style plantings, but for us, we've left our rows spaced wider, but we've tightened up the planting between the vines to sort of get the density in that direction, but still allow us to operate our tractors. When we were set up in the 90s, it was very much at the time people were focused on tractors and machinery and setting vineyards up to be run in a very mechanical sense. And so the tendency at the time was to make the rows wider so you could put bigger machines down them and put big gaps between the vines and try to grow more fruit. And then the thinking has evolved back to, no, you need to, you know, you can
now filling in the gaps.
Yes, you got to keep it tighter, have more vines producing less fruit each to get a better result. So that's the direction.
We've had a quick question, which I think might be relevant to this picture, about whether you hand harvest or machine harvest, and also which birds are you really protecting your vines from?
So everything we do is hand harvested. That's part and parcel of the quality for one, but also Pinot Noir in particular does not respond well to machine harvesting. Not that we want to do it, but you lose all the elegance, you lose the focus, the precision. You know, if you try to make a cheaper wine, you know, a more accessible price, then that's a direction you have to go. But yes, for us, everything is hand-picked. It's all hand-tended. So yes, we still use tractors to, spray and cultivate and things of that nature. But yes, all the other operations are done by hand. And birds, starlings are a problem. We have a lot of native birds, obviously, but they're not too worried about the fruit. It's more the imported birds that we have some issues with. So the native birds do other damage. We also have kangaroo problems, and the nets will help keep them out as well. So there's a few different angles that things try to come from, and deer more recently as well. Wild deer in Australia that were once farmed have escaped, and they're sort of out everywhere, and they like to come and chew on grapes as well. So yeah,
they're being attacked from all sides.
There's always Australia. There's always something trying to get it, and it depends on the year as well. Like this season, 2021, we've had some good rain, so it's still green, in the vineyard and in the bush and in the areas. Other years when it's quite dry, vineyards are very attractive to all the animals because it's a big sea of green in a drier season. And yeah, we can be. If we didn't net, we would have nothing. They would take it all. So yeah, it's always a fight, always a challenge. All right, so there we go. We can talk about the winery, maybe some winemaking.
Yes.
So with that, the map you saw, we had all the little sections from across the property. We like to keep them all separate in the winery. So we have a lot of tanks in the winery. These are the nicer section. We have some wooden vats and some concrete vats for fermentation, but we predominantly use the stainless steel for the red wine fermentation. And then for the whites, you can see the little barrels in the front. Everything we do is pressed and fermented and aged in barrel. So we don't ferment any whites in tank. It's all aged and developed in the barrel, sorry. But yes, the whole idea is that we keep all those sections separate and then bring them into the winery one by one, and they live their life as a separate parcel. So, one of that little parcel of mears I was talking about, we might get, say, 15 barrels, and those 15 will stay by themselves until the very end. About halfway through the season, we taste it and we sort of discover which parcels we think are destined for which wines. And at that point, we might start to blend. But we love to keep everything separate and give everything the chance to sort of express itself and show which part in particular is looking particularly good that year, but also, we have our favorite sections as well. So the winery was designed with that in mind. So we have a lot of smaller tanks, so we can actually fill it up with and keep everything separate throughout. So it's a very, very labor intensive experience. And again, to the question about the machine harvesting, it's the same in the winery. It's all very much slow, steady, done by hand. We don't rush anything. We don't cut corners where you can use some bigger, harder machines to do so. So it's a gravity-fed winery. We have lots of tipping and elevators and things of that nature. Again, Pinot Noir, it just needs to be gently handled and done with care.
Going to say, Glenn, before Catherine starts us on the questions, and I can see she has arrived, will you tell us a little bit about how you make your Pinot Noir? Because I've spoken about your Chardonnay because I started with that glass, but your Pinots really do pick apart terroir so beautifully, and your study of the clones. So I don't know if in the winery, if you're, choosing to use whole bunch or not using whole bunch, those sorts of philosophy stances.
Yeah. And at a base, we get something like 30 different parcels of Pinot into the winery every season, and we treat them all as best we can. We treat them all the same. So in a sense, it's I don't want to say the word recipe, it's not a recipe as such, but there's a technique or a model that we use where it's, you know, this is how we like to process wine, and that will move depending on the season. But effectively, we like to make things very similar and then let them sort of show their individual characteristics. So minimal intervention is the term that people love to use, but that's our approach behind it, is that if we get too involved or start putting in too many additives, or, you know, trying to make everything, push it so everything looks the same, we want to just give them all a basic process and then allow the individual differences to come through. And then from that, over the years, we've learned that, you know, some blocks might use like whole bunch, for instance. Works with some blocks, doesn't work with others. You know, we think it enhances the wine, so we want to push it down that direction. Sometimes we have to work some a little bit more in the harvest, just to get a little bit more out of them. But, you know, generally speaking, it's a very similar process, and it's very gentle, very hands-off. We don't do too much. It's all wild ferment as well, which can take 16 to 20 days for a ferment, which can be, you know, done in 10 days if you really want to do it fast and get it in, get it out. But we take the time to do it slowly and with care for that reason. And that's also a big part of what makes that, giving that individual difference, is allowing the ferment to work the way that it wants to work, which I consider part of a connection back to the vineyard, instead of the winery being involved in that aspect.
Definitely.
Yeah. And then, yeah, whole bunch is always an interesting one. In 2019, we used a little bit, not too much. We find that character jumps out of our wine very quickly. So it's a very fine line between a nice complement to the wine and then looking very herbaceous and stalky and juby. And yeah, we go too far, and there's a tipping point, and it's on a very low level that we like to sit on. So yeah, we use a little bit. It's a kind of, you know, a really bad metaphor would be like, you know, seasoning, or, you know, adding salt to adding salt to your food or something, like, you know, like just using a little bit, as in just to add a little extra element, but not having it drive the style.
Well, I think as a compliment to you, Glenn, when I've tasted your wines, I think you can sometimes taste whole bunch in some Pinots, but often with yours, I don't. I just taste spice. And I think there's that element of, if you can taste the winemaking on very complicated Pinots, you feel a little bit, I wish I was tasting something else. And you don't taste the winemaking, but there has been very skillful winemaking in the production of them, which I think is the real skill for you.
Absolutely, and it's taken years, and every year is different.
Yeah.
We have to take every season as it comes. Stalks are a very interesting thing, and once you put them in, you can't take them out. And if that flavor is too strong, it's there, and it's not going to go away. And there was a big style push in Australia maybe 10 years ago.
Yes.
People went hard, like really, really hard, 50, 60, 70% whole bunch.
I think you're
very stylish wines, as in you taste them and they taste like whole bunch wines. They might not taste like a Yarra Valley Pinot or a Mornington Pinot. They just taste like a whole bunch Pinot.
I think there was a wonderful moment, wonderful in a way of tasting 10 years ago, when both very high reduction levels on Chardonnay and very high whole bunch on Pinot. Yep. And that kind of, and seeing actually the producers, and Kooyong is definitely one of those that actually stayed the case and kept the wines in the style that suited the vineyards and didn't swing.
That's I think the Chardonnay in particular, you know, reduction. We can talk about that for how long we got, forever. But it's a very interesting, and I think that 2018 fault line is a really interesting example, that there's a lovely flinty sort of struck match character, but it's a very fine character, and it's not the dominating character, but it's there. And I think it's always sort of been a feature of our wines that runs through them. But yes, it was a bit of an arms race 10 years ago, and people were just really focused on creating that character to the point where you start tasting the wines and that's all you can see. And
you only get matchstick.
Yeah, and I think I really love the character. Like I really love the character, but I only want to see a small part. If it doesn't taste like fault line underneath, then it's kind of, you know.
No, I think it has to come to balance. But speaking of balance, these two wines are an absolute pleasure. I'm so delighted that I got an excuse to open both tonight. But I know that many members have asked huge numbers of questions. So I might see if we can interrupt and hand over to Catherine, who I think has a horde of questions ready to ask. And apologies in advance if we don't get to yours. We will do our best to rattle through a few.
We have had a lot of excellent questions come through. So we've picked them out, we've combined some together so we can get as many together as possible. But thank you for that, Glenn. That was really interesting. The maps particularly, I know there was a comment in the chat that one of the tastings team had commented at how nice it was to see such a colour coordinated map. And I would just like to say for myself as well, seeing the maps that clearly is such a joy when you can't go somewhere, you know, for the distance or anything. To be able to visualize it in that way is excellent, which leads us on to the first questions we've got. So the first one came in from James, and his question was, are the soils and the aspects that different in the different plots that we saw on the map? Is there much differentiation? And obviously, do you take that into account when you're deciding what to plant where, or where you're deciding to have your largest yield?
Yes is the short answer, but there is a difference. It's not a huge difference. So basically our soil is what we call sandy clay loam, which is a very basic way of saying it's got a lot of clay, it's got a lot of sand, it's got a lot of silt, which are the three things that make up basic soil. But then the percentages change as you go across the property. So the Mears are slightly sandier, and then on the other side of the property in the Haven, it's more clay based. So yes, the differences are there, but the differences aren't enormous. But that's the point of sort of teasing out those little differences. So as opposed to when you look at a sub-regional difference, which, you know, if you go higher altitude in Mornington, it becomes a red volcanic soil. So very, very different, completely different growing soil, growing results. But in Mornington, in the Kooyong property, yes, it's a subtle difference, but it's definitely a difference. And it plays out in little things. So say in summer when it rains, you know, sand, as you can imagine, works differently to something with a bit more clay. So, you know, there might be a bit more water sitting in the Haven block, and it might look a bit more flush and a bit greener, like bigger leaves, like juicier berries. You go across to Ferris, which is somewhere in the middle, and it might look a little drier and a little smaller, and, you know, you might get a bit more savouriness in the wine, a little more intensity as well. So it's just that little subtle difference that sort of plays out. And then Ferris, as the name suggests, we don't, obviously not tasting that wine, but has red ironstone in that part of the soil, and that is only there on that little stretch in the vineyard. So that's why they called it Ferris and kept it as a nice little separate section. So we feel it plays an influence on the wine, but yeah, it's the subtle differences that make a big difference when it comes to Pinot Noir in particular.
Perfect. Lovely. And then keeping with the sort of the soil theme, you touched on it slightly, but we've had a question from Maggie, and she'd like to know whether you are interested in exploring sort of the organic biodynamic way of growing, if you'd like to explore that further. I know you touched on the sort of the low intervention side, but from more of the actual in the vineyards, is that something you're looking?
Yes, absolutely. I think like everyone, you know, things have changed a lot, and when you're in the vineyard, you feel the changes considerably. And when you work with a product that's a 12-month cycle, and you can see the cycles change and how it's all happening, I think everyone's concerned, particularly when you're in a hot country anyway, like Australia, about what's going on. I think that leads into a whole big area of things like sustainability, in particular. Organics is a difficult one for us in Mornington. That water plays a big part, and we can have some very, very high humidity. This season in particular, that we're in right now, we've been getting a lot of tropical storms coming from the north, and they sort of hover around us and sit around us for a while. So we go from hot weather to humidity, and it's just super disease intensity coming through. And so it's a real balance trying to discover how we go about it, because for us to convert, it's not as simple as it might be more inland areas. I worked once in New Zealand for a biodynamic vineyard called Felton Road, which some people might know. I thought it was fascinating. I was like, wow, this is amazing. You couldn't do that in Mornington. We couldn't transfer. We have too much disease pressure. So for us, we have to come at it from a different angle. So yes, it's an important part, but we look at it from sort of a more holistic view. And I think, I don't love the word sustainability because it's the new word that's being thrown into everything, but it is the goal. Do less, do it better, do it cleaner. Obviously care more for the soil, think more about what's happening and sort of the effects that when every day you walk on there, or like what are you doing that's a negative impact, and trying to remove that instead. So yeah, the organic one is tough. We had this season, unfortunately, in Mornington, there's been one or two people who have been pushing that direction, who have been hit very, very hard with disease, and yeah, it won't be a great year for them. So it's a lesson for the rest of us that we have to find that balance between getting a crop and quality wine, but also being as soft as possible.
And leading on from the effect of sort of the water element, do you drip feed, irrigate at all?
We can, yes. Again, this season, no, we haven't yet, because we've been getting rain sort of scattered throughout summer. But yes, we have an ability to irrigate, and we will, in a warmer season, we will irrigate. On the map, you can see there's a big dam right in the middle. So we catch quite a bit of water. We get a lot of rain. A lot of our rain comes in winter and spring, and so then we catch that water. Oh, we're going back, and then we.
I'm not sure.
Number 2.
Here.
And then yes, we can catch it, and we can irrigate if we need to, which we prefer not to, but we have quite dry soils in summer. Then we just needed to use a little bit. But again, that falls into sustainability and your practice. Not irrigating too much, not wasting water. We get a lot better at. The old fashion was just to have a bare ground under the vines, and then you'd have a hot summer, and all of a sudden all the water is gone, and you're having to add more water. So we're getting a lot better at cover cropping and mulching and doing things of that nature that really just help keep the moisture in and help build it that direction.
Perfect. John Kavanagh has asked that, he's commented that he noticed that there was some Shiraz planting, which took him a bit by surprise, and he's wondering the thinking behind the. It's
Australia. We had to. So that was it.
Of course.
It was. I'm not even joking when I say that. It was in the 90s, and they at the time, Pinot Noir was growing in popularity, but it was still a very, very, very niche thing. So this undertaking was actually quite I wouldn't say a risk, but it was definitely a pretty big undertaking at the time. And I reckon there was a little bit of Shiraz put in as insurance policy at the time. So we do make Shiraz from it, and you have to come maybe in a year or two when we're allowed to travel again. And taste it at our cellar door. That's probably the only place you'll get to try it. So it's interesting, and we do look at it in the warmer seasons that we've been having, in the warmer climate. That maybe there's interest there, or it's going to make something more interesting. But yeah, at the moment it's just a small block that we don't do much with. But yeah, we never wanted to throw it away. So yeah.
Perfect. The next question we've had is about your Chardonnays. Now the question is whether you use mallow. Now, just for members that may not know or may not be as familiar with what that is, that's the malolactic fermentation is where the malic acid is converted to lactic acid to give that slightly more creamier texture and taste. Is that something that you use, or?
No, we tend not to. We'll let a little bit go through or convert from one acid to another. But for us, when we're picking, we like to pick with what that acid looks like is what we want to carry to the bottle. So for us, we want to retain that acid, and I think it just gives a freshness to the wine, not having it go through the malolactic fermentation. Having said that, in a cooler season, if it feels a little too acidic, we'll let a little bit go through, but we're very much a no malo winery. And yeah, freshness, that more citrus flavored intensity on the palate is something we really value and really like. And I like, what word did you use? Precision, Sarah, linear. I love that in a white, and sometimes I find the malo in the whites can sort of throw it out, where I really like a really not lean, but a very driven style of Chardonnay. I think malo can upset that sometimes.
I think to go through full malo on Chardonnays, you have to know you start with incredibly high acidity. So to really, and sometimes, as you say, it can be a blend. You can let some go through and blend it back. But yeah, keeping that very firm acidity, which is so refreshing. Like I'm quite worried about how much of this wine I'm now consuming on a Tuesday night. But
Australia, it's okay.
But the bottle is going down. I'm definitely toasting Australia Day at this end.
Some people use it for building body as well. Whereas we prefer to come at it. Well, for one, we have a natural fruit sweetness in the wine. Like, it's not sugar sweet, but that kind of riper Australian flavour. It's naturally there. We age on the lees in the barrel, which give a bit of and you might see it in that fault line. Like, to me, it's cashew or oatmeal. You get this very interesting flavour, but also gives a little bit of width to the palate as well. And so that's
I often think that lees for me taste of Greek yogurt, and there's a touch of that acidity of that Greek yogurt that you can get. That that oatmeal yogurt kind of No, there's definitely more body that you've built in through other means.
And then time as well. In the bottle, if it ever does feel a bit tighter, like a cooler season, they're the ones that generally you're really going to want to open in a few years and embrace them at that point. Whereas when we were talking the other week, I saw that the Wine Society still has 2016 for us.
Yes, one bottle as of afternoon. So
that was a slightly warmer earlier season. So for me, that's drinking beautifully right now. Whereas something like the 18, I think it's drinking well now, but that will that another 5, 6, 7 years for that wine will be even better. So it depends on the season as well. But the 16s have a bit more generosity to them. And they're tasting pretty good at the moment as well.
Perfect. We've had a question from Roger, going back to the hand harvesting element. He said that in Europe, a lot of hand harvesting means having seasonal pickers from Eastern Europe. Has there been, is there a good source of local pickers? Do you have people that come sort of back every year? And do they come from further afield, or are they sort of primarily Australia based, locally based?
It's a very good question. Very topical at the moment because of the closed borders. There's a lot of problems with picking fruit, but we escape that because of our proximity to Melbourne. So we're about, I live in the outer suburbs of Melbourne. That's how close we are. 30 minutes, to the city, it's 50 minutes or something. So we're very close. So we have a huge labour pool to pull on, to call on. Whereas the people who have problems are, 6 hours north of somewhere remote in Queensland trying to grow tomatoes or something, and that's where they rely on it. So a lot of our pickers are of either Vietnamese or Cambodian descent. Huge populations, not huge, but big populations came in after the war, early 80s, and they have taken up picking, and they pick grapes and they work in vineyards, but they work in some of the berry farms and the orchards and things like that. So yes, we've been using the same group for, some of them have been there for 15 plus years. Really good workers, really quality workers and good people. And fortunately in Australia, sometimes you do pay a little bit more for our wine, but we like to think that we have a bit of a fairer payment system here. The minimum wage is pretty decent, and it's pretty controlled. There's some people still trying to do things the wrong way, but it's very organized in terms of paying the people, and the labor is well covered for that. So it's a nice little system, and good people and good growers, good pickers and good workers.
Excellent. We've had a question from Susan about the names of the wines, particularly Marcel and Clonel. The sort of the meaning and the connotations behind the names. Is that something? There
is. So I'll start on the other end. The single vineyard or single block wines, they get a geographical name. So the fault line, there is an actual fault that runs through the property. It's not big and it's not active, but when they were doing the surveys, they discovered a geographical fault in that part of the vineyard, so it gets the fault line name. Ferrous is the ironstone haven. So on the map, you might have seen there's a big, it's about 15-acre bushland that surrounds that part of the vineyard. And because of that, it is like a haven from the weather. So on the really hot northerlies coming in, that buffers a bit of the wind, whereas you could be in the Ferrous block or the Mears and it's just, you can feel the heat or the wind. You step into the haven and it feels a little bit more protected and safer, I guess. And Mears, like a mere is a body of water, and that's where we have dams on the property, but also a creek that runs through, and it's created another body of water next to it. So it doesn't really influence the wine, but it's a nice name. And Farrago means, it's a Latin word, I believe, for a mixture. And so what happened in Farrago is when they were digging in the soil, it's got sandstone and pebbles running through it. And so normally the soil is in very distinct layers, whereas the Farrago soil is a bit of a jumble. So that was to them unique, and they put that section on that little part of the vineyard and said, right, that will go on there, and it got the name Farrago. And then Clonel and Massal, I think they're French names related back to some French vineyard operations. So Clonel meaning, like a bunch of clones, a whole lot of clones going in together. Whereas Massal is the selection. Massal is where you use a mother vine to take a cutting and then use that to plant out your vineyard, which is a very popular technique in Burgundy. That's not what we do. So I think it was a nice, catchy name, little French, a little throwback to the influence, I guess, of the winemaking and the wine styles. But that's why it's nice, because we also have that more Australian names on the single blocks and more geographical, which I think it's a nice balance between the old and the new. I'd say. So they're catchy names. The last two more than actual geographical or anything like that.
Perfect. That leads us quite nicely into a question from Leah, and she's asking, what is your favourite Kooyong wine to produce?
Good question. I would say probably the Chardonnay, and it's only because my background was, I've worked a lot with white wine, and I always had a fascination. Australia is a very red wine dominated marketplace and always has been. For instance, you put in a Pinot Noir vineyard and you plant Shiraz because you just have to. So I always thought white wine was a very interesting thing that you could go. I worked in the Loire Valley, I worked in the Mosel, and I love the fact that they were 100% white wine regions or white wine wineries. Like in where we worked in Germany, it was like 99.5% white and this little thing of red in the corner, and that was it. And I loved it because I feel like in Australia sometimes we do value the white wines, but it's always the red is always the sort of the top. And so I take a lot of pride in the Chardonnay, and because I just love them, and I love drinking the product afterwards too. There's something about it that just works. So yeah, probably with the Chardonnay, I'd say. The fault line or the Farrago, it depends on the season. So one of those two.
Lovely. And that leads us very nicely onto our last question, talking about drinking the wines. We've had a question from Sean, and she has asked, they have asked, what would your sort of drinking window for the Farrago 2016 and the Ferris 2014, what would the windows be? And also they have a 12-week-old baby boy, so congratulations, Sean. And they're asking which of the 2020 vintage would be ideal to keep back for when their son can drink them. So I presume for keeping for 18 years if we're going on the legal requirements.
Wow, yeah, hey, well, that's congratulations. Maybe. And yeah, legally, I won't speak to that. You can open it when you want, but okay. So 2020, I think, is a white season for sure. It was a cooler season, and the acidity is just like it's strong, but in a very positive way. Like they're very powerful acid-driven wines. And every time I taste them, because they're still in barrel, we'll bottle those in about 3 weeks' time. I think they've got a long life in front of them. The reds do as well, but I just think if you want to go 18 years. And I think it'd be fair to say Australia-wide, go the whites for that one. And 16 Farrago. So as I mentioned before, I think it's drinking perfectly now, but they still, all the single vineyard whites, for me, 5 to 10, somewhere in that range is when they really start to, they shed a little bit of the fruit, and they pick up a bit more savouriness and maybe sort of a bit more width to the wine. But it's kind of the nice balance between the fruit and the sort of development. If you go after sort of 9, 10, 11 years, that's when it can start to really, turn into a more savoury, buttery sort of style. So for me, yeah, I like that. Warmer seasons, 5, 6, 7 years. So sort of now for the next 3 years for the 16 Farrago. Having said that, it will go much, much longer. And what was the other one? 14?
The 14 Ferris.
14 Ferris, I would say, is probably, sooner than later. 14s are a more savoury, earthier vintage. So if the longer you leave it, if you like that undergrowthy sort of more, I was going to say composty. That's a strong word, but that leaf litter sort of
earthy.
Earthy. There we go. Earthy. Then 14 is a good vintage for you, and if you leave it longer, it will just develop more. But the 14s have that character running through them. So if you're into that, let it go. But otherwise, yeah, just drink it and buy another one or something else. It'll be all right.
I'm always very impressed with members that can hold any of your stock. They seem to burn a hole in my wine rack when I.
I'm always really surprised every time I'm over. Someone always brings up some random bottle from something. They say, "Oh, I've got a 2009 Farrago." I'm like, "Oh, wow."
Much more discipline than I do. I have to buy it in mixed case and keep it at the Wine Society if I have any hope at all of keeping them.
But with the other two wines, the Clenal and the Sale, they are designed for a design.
Yes.
They can be drunk now, happily drunk now, but you don't have to race into them. You can sit on them for a few years. In fact, I tend to like Clenal a bit more after 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Marsal, like it's you can drink it now, but I've had 5, 6, 7-year-old Marsals and they still feel pretty fresh and bright and interesting. So you don't have to just get straight into them. You can let them last more than 24 hours.
I was going to say, I think my Marsal is only going to last perhaps until tomorrow evening.
Wonderful.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Glenn. That was incredible, just over an hour there. Members, if there are any questions that we didn't get to and you would like an answer, hopefully we'll be able to pop some questions to you by email, Glenn, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So if anyone has a question that we didn't get to, would you please be able to email it to us just at the tastings@thewinesociety.com email address, and we can get that sorted for you. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Sarah, for stepping in. It was lovely to have you this evening. Always nice to have you with our events. And thank you so much, Glenn, particularly as it is so early for you to have to launch into this webinar for us. But it was excellent. So thank you very much indeed.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Thanks ever so much, Catherine. Thank you, Glenn.
All right. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
See you all. Cheers.